Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of DMV Confidential. I'm Kenzie Chase.
And I'm Jenny Gable.
And today we have a new episode for you to talk about. So the story we want to talk to you guys about today is about an incident that happened back in 1987 in Prince William County when a 50-year-old woman who was just working at a gas station as a clerk was raped while going to the bathroom. So the story we want to talk to you guys about today is about the 1987 rape cold case.
Yeah, Kenzie, so it was December 19th, 1987, when this worker who was just working at the Chevron gas station on what is now Richmond Highway, I believe in the Woodbridge area. She went to use the restroom, as you said, and which was outside of the building where she was working, like at a lot of gas stations. And that's where she kind of encountered a man who she didn't recognize, who followed her into the bathroom there. And unfortunately, he did end up raping and sexually assaulting her. She told investigators that he had a knife in his hand, and without getting into too many graphic details, did also use duct tape to kind of restrain her as well.
Right. So this is actually a bit of a different case for us. We've covered a lot of homicides in our time with this show so far, but this is our first case that we're kind of diving into, a case that is specifically about a rape.
Yeah.
So as we go forward, I mean, Jenny's kind of already touched on it, but as we go forward, discretion's advised, just because we will be diving into some of the evidence and some of the details on this case. But like you mentioned, Jenny, like, as far as she knows, she was walking into the bathroom outside. Man followed her in with duct tape and knife and restrained her and raped her.
Yeah, and this happened around 11, between like 11 and 11:30 p.m. Investigators told us that pictures from the scene that night show that it was like a clear night, but it was, nighttime, dark outside. And this woman, she did go to the hospital where they collected something called a physical evidence recovery kit, or a PERC kit, to kind of gather physical evidence from her as well. That was collected the next day.
We do hear a lot of cases of sexual assault and rape where the victim does not go directly to the hospital immediately after because of obvious trauma and not wanting to relive it. Sometimes they don't even acknowledge that it happened. But in this case, she actually did go to the hospital and get a PERC kit done. So there was some evidence collected from that. There was also duct tape found in the bathroom with some hairs on it that were consistent with what the victim described as happening to her. And there was also clothes and underwear taken from the woman to kind of help investigators with this investigation. The woman was able to actually get a pretty good description of the perpetrator, but again, it's kind of hard at this time with DNA testing to kind of narrow down who actually did it. There was no witnesses.
Yeah.
So it makes it very challenging for investigators. But I do want to play a clip because the case does eventually go cold. But after the case kind of resurfaces, we talk to a CSI agent who discusses some of the evidence in this case. So I'm going to play that for you guys real quick.
But what we do with every single case is before we decide what needs to go to the lab to be retested, we will go through and take photographs of all the packaging. We'll make sure everything is sealed correctly, and if it's not, we'll put it in better packaging so that way things aren't falling apart. In this case, I think we were very lucky that everything was packaged in a way that would preserve it for further testing. But what we do with every single case is before we decide what needs to go to the lab to be retested, we will go through and take photographs of all the packaging. We'll make sure everything is sealed correctly, and if it's not, we'll put it in better packaging so that way things aren't falling apart. In this case, I think we were very lucky that.
Yeah.
So I think she touches on it, but there was DNA evidence that was taken from the scene that the CSI agent was able to use to sort of look at forensically, which helped.
Yeah, and something that she did tell us when we talked to her on that, she notices in a lot of cases like this, specifically from like the 70s or 80s, and with a lot of cold cases like this, is that the way that investigators may have packaged these items of evidence at the time may not be, like, when they're going back and re-looking at the case, it might be a little bit difficult for investigators now.
Because she talks about how, like, they didn't even know DNA was going to be a thing. So, like, how would they know how to properly preserve it? They didn't even know that technology was going to be so advanced that you were going to be able to pull DNA and narrow down suspects and stuff like that. So,
because back then DNA, you know, in cases like this wasn't around like that, wasn't the end all be all in the way that it is a lot of times in cases today.
So she did describe that they knew from pretty early on that at least the DNA was a male. I mean, just based off of, I think they could even have narrowed that down from just witness account from the victim, but they did know that the evidence was male. It was just a matter of what male.
Yeah, so the PERT kit that was collected was submitted to the Department of Forensic Science, and they developed this unknown male DNA profile. But when they submitted it to the FBI database, which we've talked about a bit before on our episodes on the CODIS database, there was no hit, which basically means that there was, because this database has a lot of, it will be people who have prior convictions and things like that that might pop up, but there was no hit on who this could be with this DNA that they found.
So this case obviously went cold pretty early on in the investigation, but it was reopened in 2019, and that was when Detective Gina Pinedo got this case and reopened it and looked back into it. And she has about 22 years of experience. Yeah. So she dived right in as best she could, right? And she was able to sort of look at this, reopen it, and then she was actually recruited another detective who has experience with sort of these sexual assault cases.
Yeah, so she said that, you know, when she took over in this unit in 2019, they gave her like a different list of rape cold cases, and this was one of the ones that she was working on, and she kind of reached out to, as you mentioned, Kenzie, Detective Colleen Grantham, who has experience specializing in sexual assaults. So together they worked together to kind of reopen this case and try to re-examine some of the evidence and facts of what happened that day.
And I believe Andrea was brought on in 2020.
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong. So after Gina was previously brought on.
Yeah, but Andrea, who we just heard from, she was brought on, a few years about a year after.
They all kind of worked on this case together, which I think is super, we'll talk more about this later, but this is actually just unique, and I want to bring this up front at the beginning of this, just because I don't know if anybody who's been keeping up with this show so far has noticed, but we haven't really heard a lot from women in this field.
Right.
So this is kind of interesting in the fact that the main three people kind of pushing the needle on this are all women, and I just thought that was kind of interesting.
No, yeah, for sure. I believe, like you said, Kenzie, we were talking about it earlier, that we haven't really had the opportunity to kind of speak with any lead detectives or investigators on these cases who have been women, like primarily leading this. So that's definitely something that stuck out to me too, that they're able to kind of take charge of this case and kind of investigate further.
So when Andrea was brought on, she started looking into the idea of genetic genealogy, which was kind of a new concept back then. It's also very expensive, so it's something that a lot of police don't necessarily want to put the resources in because it's so pricey. So they usually try to like hone in on cases that they really think could be solved with this, but that was around the summer of 2021.
Yeah, so she had actually tried to get fingerprints or test fingerprints from the duct tape that we had mentioned earlier, but that came back with, they weren't able to kind of decipher anything from that. So then, as you said, Kenzie, they kind of turned to genetic genealogy, which we've seen more in recent
family
years.
Trees, building family trees, narrowing it down, trying to figure out which suspect that is. But there's an interesting twist with this one. So after they were able to get approval from Police Chief Newsham, he was the one who okayed this funding, they went ahead and submitted it for testing. They tried it through CODIS and all that stuff that we mentioned earlier, but they submitted it to try to narrow down who this person could be.
Yeah, and by September 2021, Andrea told us that she actually met with someone named, I believe, Lori Prue at Virginia State Lab to kind of take more items of evidence that they had from the PERT kit to be submitted to Marshall University for the genetic genealogy testing there.
Yeah, and in January 2022, Marshall U contacted them and said the samples that were sent were too degraded, so it kind of had to go back to the drawing board, send different samples, see what could be a match, how they could figure out how to use the DNA that they did have.
Yeah, and then that was March of that year as well. She met again with Lori Prue to try to get more samples to get tested. And then that's by August 2022 when Parabon, which is a company which was contracted with Marshall University, sent results of the genetic genealogy to tell investigators,
right.
actually.
And here is the twist that we were talking about, is that this DNA that they find from this male, from the suspect, doesn't come back necessarily to one specific individual.
Right, which we
right
have not
rip.
seen in a case that we've covered.
It comes back
like this.
to twins, identical twins at that.
Yeah, so the evidence that they had sent was actually cuttings from the woman's underwear that they were able to kind of examine, and that linked back to identical twins, like you said, Kenzie, John Arthur Marubio and Russell Anthony Marubio.
And before we get too much into who is the suspect, investigators, before they even ever actually confirmed or figured out who it was, they're already based off of these two twins that came back. And based off the description that the witness, the victim, described, they were pretty confident in which of the twin brothers it was. But of course, you want to be sure, especially if this is going to go to trial. So they kept working, and they were able to narrow down who it was, because even though they are identical twins, there are, in some cases, some rare mutations that occur, even among identical twins, that it provides a slight differentiation between the two.
Yeah, but the interesting part about that is that, Parabon did kind of tell investigators, they were very quick to kind of get on board with helping out with this case, but they did say that, the realistic expectation is there's really only a 50-50 chance that they would be able to differentiate between the two twins who are identical. And DNA twin testing like this hadn't really been done in the U.S.
No, it was the first case.
Only really had been kind of done overseas. I believe they mentioned in Europe. So this was kind of a big deal that they were able to kind of use the technology in this way to try to figure out who did this.
Right. And so when we talk about roadblocks in this case, I mean, where do we start? Because there are roadblocks right from the get-go of this being 1987, and you don't have the DNA testing that we have today. They didn't have any relation. As far as they're aware, the victim and the suspect, either brother, didn't have any relationship to this woman.
Yeah, and there was no witnesses around and things like that. And as you said, Kenzie, DNA testing wasn't nearly at the level that it was at. So investigators, they did take cheek swabs from both of the brothers, which came back as a match, again, to that DNA that was collected. But since they were twins, it was then the issue, like we were talking about, of having to decipher which twin. And
even though they are identical twins, obviously, if you've ever seen an identical twin, they don't necessarily look exactly like their brother. So, or twin, whoever the situation is. But in this case, they did not look alike. And so that's why, again, investigators felt pretty confident they knew which brother it was.
Yeah, and I believe they told us that Gina actually was able to kind of reach out to some old friends of theirs and kind of interview people that they knew in high school and like learn about what each twin was involved in, look at yearbook photos to kind of further identify which twin it was. And they, they told us that even if the DNA testing didn't come back to decipher who was who, that they felt pretty confident in this case about which twin it was.
Right. And you also have to think about, like, when you mentioned high school photos, Jenny, that just reminded me, like, this is 1987 when this happened, and it's 2022-ish when they're kind of getting to this point, this, like, apex.
Point.
Yeah. So they're looking at this, and then Parabon was able to conclusively identify this twin. And that was interesting because, like you mentioned, Jenny, they had a 50-50 shot. But I just want to talk briefly about some of the roadblocks that we had just talked about. and then we'll kind of give you the grand reveal of which twin investigators say did it.
Specific roadblocks for this case, I would definitely say that when we found out that they were identical twins and that our lab was not able to differentiate them, that was a huge stumbling point for us because we had originally thought that they were not identical twins and that our lab was going to be able to separate them, but there was some mix up with the abandoned DNA that Florida had received. So once we got both known samples and we found out that they were identical twins, we were kind of scrambling at that point. Specific road.
Yeah, so yeah, you can kind of hear how they're talking about once they found out that they were identical. Because again, something like this hadn't really been done in the U.S. They hadn't, and they told us
there's a lot of room for error.
Yeah, and
they
told
50-50, that's like a flip of a coin.
And they told us that they both, they hadn't really worked on a case like this. Like, this was very unique to them. So to find this out, this was definitely something that kind of, ruffled the feathers of what they were trying to do.
Absolutely. And so when Parabon finally was able to conclusively identify the twin, it did come back as Russell Marubio. That was the twin whose DNA was found at the crime scene based on the unique mutations.
Yeah.
Now, Russell did not have any previous convictions, which is why he wasn't found in the CODIS system.
Yeah, so I think that's important to note too, because in these cases, it can seem like, well, they have the DNA, how did they not know? But again, if they don't have prior convictions, their DNA is not in the system, that's when they have to kind of look at other ways to try to identify who it was. But as you said, Kenzie, they did conclusively identify it as Russell, and he was arrested on June 23rd, 2023, and he was charged with abduction and rape, and then he actually was released on bond, which was interesting to me as well.
Yeah, that's kind of, we've talked about this, I mean, just the fact that like some of these cases when people get released and why that might be, and it's always challenging. We don't know exactly what that decision was. Maybe because it was so long ago.
Maybe because he didn't have any other kind of run-ins with law enforcement. There could be different reasons, but he was arrested actually in Florida.
Yeah, where
so not
he was
in
living.
This area.
Yeah, so he was arrested in Florida and then extradited.
Yes. And then he did have a preliminary hearing, and that was on November 21st, 2023, but his jury trial didn't actually start until pretty recently this year, actually, August 18th, 2025.
Right. And then on August 18th, he did plead not guilty. So this is a case of it goes to trial.
Yeah.
And sure enough, all these women that we have seen so far on our shows have had to go and testify. And I mean, I can't imagine, like, that's probably challenging in of itself. Like, this is a new technology. But in the trial, they actually didn't really contest the evidence of whose DNA it was, which I thought was interesting.
No, I agree, because you would think that, the defense might try to poke holes in the way that they collected it, because this hadn't really been done before in court in this way in the U.S., but they actually told us that the defense really, they had him go up on the stand and he really just kind of painted the narrative that this was a consensual encounter and not a rape, that this was a consensual thing.
Right.
So.
Which I think made it hard for his defense just based on the evidence of the duct tape that was found. But that's what their argument was, that it was consensual, and they didn't really pick at the DNA evidence that it was him, which, again, I think is interesting because, like you mentioned, Jenny, it's never been done before in the U.S.
Yeah, so, and I think the fact, like you said, with the duct tape and things like that, and the fact that, there was a knife that was used, I thought it was interesting that that was kind of the way that they took, was painting it as that it was consensual. So
now that it goes to trial, and so I'm going to play a clip with detectives talking about it actually going to trial.
I think the three of us were ecstatic that, I mean, this is the first time that we've brought a cold case to trial, the three of us. So that was also like, hey, we can actually do this and bring some closure to that part of the process for the victim. I think. Yeah, and kind of on that note, bringing closure, he was convicted
on August 29th, 2025, and he was taken into custody. At the time, I believe he was about 54 years old. So he would have been around, late 30s at the time of the crime. So he was convicted in this case.
Yes, so they did get a successful verdict in this case. But I also just want to go back to the fact that this was their first case. And when they're referring to the three of them, they're referring to the CSI agent Andrea, and then obviously the two detectives that we saw in that video. But there's not just them that were involved.
Yeah, there was a lot of women actually involved in this case behind the scenes,
yes.
Further investigating, which again, like we talked about earlier, it's something that, male-dominated field you don't really get to see, and I think that's a really big deal.
Yeah, and it's not just CSI agent, it's not just detectives, it's across the board, like you mentioned, Jenny. And some of those names, in fact, we're going to go through a couple of them, includes Lee Clark, which is the Deputy Director of Forensic Science in the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. We have Margaret, I don't know how to say this last name, Radigan, who's in Jacksonville Regional Operations Center. And now we have the Deputy Commonwealth Attorney's Office as well, Reagan Klein and Megan Aglin. So a ton of people, a ton of women helped bring this case to its closure.
And I think another thing about this too is, you see a lot of, these sexual assault cases involve, women as victims. Not all the time, but you do see that largely. So the fact that women were kind of involved here to bring justice to, the suspect that committed this is really,
right.
striking.
And not to bring us into the story, but even us talking about it. I mean, we're women.
Yeah.
So from start of this journey, even to us talking about it now, has been very woman driven, and I just think that in of itself is kind of a cool little, it's kind of a cool little snippet, especially women do tend to have this fear of something like this happening.
Yeah, because again, she was just working at this gas station, just going to the restroom. For something traumatic like that to happen, she's just at her workplace working. I know. And I just, it's just really a horrible thing to even think about. So
yeah. So like you said, on December 11th, Russell was sentenced to 25 years total in prison. So that's where he'll be for the next 25 years.
Yeah, and they weren't able to really determine an exact motive in this case.
Right.
They just knew that he did come to the gas station that night with duct tape and a knife.
And that's what I even asked them that, because he came with duct tape and a knife. Do they believe that it was premeditated? That's kind of a weird
maybe
item to just have on you.
Maybe he had seen her before, or just planned to do this no matter what.
But the detectives said that they couldn't determine a cause for that. So that's just kind of where it stood. But I want to play a clip of kind of them talking about what we just said about the fact that this was woman-driven.
Commonwealth attorneys are female for this case. The lab people were all female. Obviously, the three of us were. So I don't think it really hit me until we were all gathered together to really see what we did as a group.
It's really an impressive thing.
Right.
Again, this is kind of a landmark case in the sense of the way that they were able to use this genetic genealogy, and the fact that it was women-driven in a male-dominated field is definitely important.
A little poetic to me. I don't know. Maybe that's me being cheesy, but...
No, I agree. I think it's definitely, definitely an important thing. And just quickly touching on the victim in this case really quickly, they did tell us that she did participate in the preliminary hearing but wasn't able to actually participate in the actual trial as well. But
she was alive to see justice served,
yes,
which is great.
Yes.
So that was a lot for us to talk about. It's different than what we usually discuss, I feel like. Again, usually talking about homicides, but...
Especially with the cold cases, there's a lot of homicides
Right,
involved.
Absolutely, Jenny. And it's kind of different to kind of navigate this one. So, but if you want to keep hearing more cases like this, like our homicide cases that we discuss, you can keep following up with us on dcnewsnow.com. You can find us on our CTV app, DC News Now, and we'll see you next time.